Welcome to FemLead, the podcast on female leadership and role models. This show aims to inspire and equip you with the tools you need to navigate your career plans. FemLead brings inspiring career perspectives and strategies to guide your path to success. Your host, Alexandra, will interview role models on new, exciting topics with each episode. If you like what you hear, give us a review and subscribe to the show on your preferred streaming platform. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of FemLead. My next guest is a technology leader with more than 25 years of experience, with a background in strategy consulting, market development, and commercial decision-making at the Financial Times Stock Exchange 100 Index. Today, we welcome Caroline Gorski, the Group Director of R2 Data Labs, the data innovation and artificial intelligence catalyst inside Rolls Royce. The organization creates data and AI-based innovations, applications, and services that improve the way Rolls Royce and its customers operate. Previously, Caroline was head of IoT and digital manufacturing at Digital Catapult, as well as the former head of business development IoT for Telefonica UK. She is also the co-founder of Emergent Alliance, a not-for-profit global data collaboration initiative focusing on economic recovery analytics in response to COVID-19. There are many accolades and accomplishments to share about Caroline, and I cannot wait to deep dive into our interview today. So without further ado, Caroline, welcome. It's an honor to have you here. Join us. How are you today?
Hi, Alexandra. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you on the podcast. I'm great today. I will make one very tiny amendment to your very kind introduction. It's actually R² Data Labs. And the reason being, of course, that R² is the correlation coefficient. So there's a little bit of a joke for statisticians there in our name. But I do quite often have to explain that to people. So I'm not quite sure we've got the...
Well, it's good you did. It's good you did, because obviously today we will talk about your impressive career. And I really wanted for a long time to have a leader from the AI IoT space come join us and tell us what does it mean to work in this field. Because as the world evolves and the more we talk about these functions and roles inside companies, there seems to be this misunderstanding of what does it mean exactly. And people are a bit confused about what does a professional in this field actually, it does every day. And I really want to share your experience and your advice with young women and men looking to deep dive into this field. So without further ado, I would like to ask you to tell us, to start with, what does it mean to be a group director and what does it entail to work for R² Data Labs?
Okay, so I guess let me start that off by saying, obviously, Rolls Royce is a global power business. We consider ourselves to be an industrial technology company. We essentially are part of the really challenging question that we face in our world about how do we generate the power that we need to do the things that we want to do, to make the connections that we want to make, to fuel our digital capabilities and our travel and all of the things that as humans we increasingly use to occupy our space. But how do we do that in a way which is sustainable? How do we do that in a way which doesn't continue to create really challenging situations for our world? How do we do that in a way which lessens our carbon footprint? How do we do that in a way which means that we can sustain the expectations for our lives that we have here in the West for ourselves, but also promote the prosperity and the growth of other countries around our world, but without poisoning the planet that we live on. And Rolls Royce is at the forefront of all of those technologies. And you'll have seen, I hope, over the last sort of 6 months or so, with the announcements around our small modular reactor program and our ability to now start bringing some real focus and attention to new ways of thinking about nuclear power generation, with the approaches that we've taken in the work we've led in COP26 around our sustainable power generation, for example, for data centers, with our fuel cells and hydrogen microgrid capability. And with, in fact, very much today, the announcement that the Spirit of Innovation, our fully electric power set for flight, has beaten the airspeed record for a fully electric plane. So we're absolutely at the forefront of looking at how we transform power generation into carbon neutral, low carbon, or even zero carbon options. Now, a big part of that journey is in understanding how data and artificial intelligences can help us to both produce and consume power in ways which are much, much greater in efficiency. And that's critically important as we move into new power generating systems, where we're looking at distributed power generated across whole grids and networks, where we're trying to bring renewable energy into grids. We're trying to bring new power generation and power storage systems from hydrogen, from battery power. And we are increasingly needing to understand the responsiveness and the flexibility of the network, the brain, if you like, of the power consumption and power generation systems that we all need as consumers to be able to actually draw down on those technologies in a way which is much more efficient, which really right sizes our power consumption for the power that we actually need. It becomes much less wasteful, and an awful lot of that actually is built on an understanding of how data flows across those networks, how it tells us, what sorts of power generation we need at what times, in what places, and also how it helps us predictably manage those networks in a way to maximize their uptime, and therefore make sure that we are wasting as little of the precious fuels that we need in order to generate that power as possible. And that's really where, from a Rolls Royce perspective, data analytics and artificial intelligence come into play. They are about helping us to create a world in which, by combining the best of the data-driven technologies and the best of the digital technologies, we're able to massively increase the efficiency of our production and consumption of power, so as to actually lower, therefore, the footprint that we leave on the world from a sustainability perspective. Being a group director, which was your first question, really means owning that strategy for both Rolls-Royce, and increasingly over the last 12 to 18 months, we in R Squared have been starting to take our experiences in this safety critical, industrial, asset intensive space and make those available to external clients too. So R Squared Data Labs over the last 18 months has been taking some of the things that we've learned across Rolls-Royce for the last 4 years about how you deploy data-led kind of whole systems thinking, and how you develop artificial intelligence applications in industrial contexts. And we've been starting to work with external clients alongside Rolls-Royce and outside of our relationship with Rolls-Royce. So we're beginning to bring those learnings to new sectors, particularly focused on safety critical, asset intensive sectors outside of our own. So those would be industries like the automotive industry, like the pharmaceuticals industries, like mining and oil and gas industries, the sorts of places where these same really big challenges of how do you lessen the negative impacts of extremely asset intensive businesses on the physical world in which we all live.
I mean, it sounds not only interesting, it is the future, and you definitely work with the future of work. You definitely invest a lot of energy and a lot of money also in what will technology bring forward. And you've mentioned impact. I was wondering if you can tell us a bit more about, obviously, as a group director in this field, you definitely feel your work is very impactful. But can you share more about how the people should perceive AI and how it will impact the future of work? What should we really understand about AI when it comes to how the world evolves?
Okay, so I'd say there's probably a couple of strands that I want to answer that question from. Okay, so the first is to say that artificial intelligence and advanced data analytics are simply another tool and another technology set that we can use to have value and impact show up. But that value and impact is not inherent in those technologies. That value and impact comes from the way that we use those technologies to change what we do. So the honest truth is that there is no inherent value in artificial intelligence. The inherent value is in the business processes, the human activities, the changes to the way that we live in our world that can be assisted by artificial intelligence. So when people, talk to me about hype around AI and, it's overhyped, it's underhyped, it's going to change the world, it's not going to change the world. My honest answer is artificial intelligence won't change the world. People deploying artificial intelligence in a way which augments or extends or changes how humans show up in the world, that's what makes the change. It's not the technology in and of itself, it's how we choose to use it. So that would be my first answer. And then my second answer is, because the other question that I often get asked is, you're part of the problem, you work in artificial intelligence, you're basically building the robots that are gonna, become our overlords, we're all gonna be slaves to the machines. And in a slightly jokey way, I turn around and say, you're already slaves to the machines, my friends. If you watch Netflix, if you get recommendations from Amazon, if you have your Alexa help set your schedule for you, you are already a slave to the machine. The machines are already in our lives. The challenge that we face is, how do we make the right choices as humans, the right ethical choices about how we program and how we decide how those machines are going to work alongside us. So I think the idea that we aren't already living in the future is mistaken. We are already living in the future of the robots, but we still have an amazing opportunity as human beings to make choices about how these new assistants that we are creating that run alongside us, what ethical places we choose to deploy those in, and how we choose to deploy them. And these are really important questions that I take a position on, that my team helps support take a position on in our context as a developer of industrial artificial intelligence solutions. And we see many colleagues and peers, across the technology space, also very actively taking an exploratory role or a leading position in trying to think about this for other applications of artificial intelligence.
And you've mentioned very rightfully the fact that the future is already here, and by the fact that we use so many different apps, we already share so much information. You mentioned the ethics of AI, and I feel like that's a topic in itself that can take days to answer. But related to humans and AI and roles that we play in enhancing this technology, what do you think about all of these questions about whether AI will replace the workforce? And what do you think about the ethics of even considering this conversation that can be so much larger than this? What do you feel people should take into account when they are, maybe afraid of the future of AI and how workforce will look in a few years?
Well, so the first thing, I start answering this question by giving you a little bit of context about me, which is that I'm an arts graduate, right? I have a history and English degree. And that's important because actually, when you look at this very specifically at this question you've asked, being able to understand the history of the human development of methods of work is really important when you think about the next biggest transformation in human methods of work. So if we were having this conversation 300 years ago, okay, there would be no concept of a steam engine. There would be no concept of power assisted support for doing heavy things. There would be very little industrial processing or machinery available. You might have a plow, you might have some rudimentary tools, but there would be very little that we right now would recognize as the industrial setup of the world. Even if we were having this conversation 200 years ago, there would be no electricity. There would be essentially an agrarian workforce whose lives were governed by the harvests that they had to bring in. Even if we were having this conversation 100 years ago, there would be no computers. There would be no computer controlled systems. There would be no ability to run automated processes. There would be, because you wouldn't have time controls available to factories. And so that although you'd started to see the beginnings of the deployment of the Industrial Revolution and the deployment of steam engines and the increasing mechanization of work, it's only, if we sat down 50 years ago that we would be able to have a conversation about work which encompassed both mechanically assisted processing, electricity, and rudimentary computer controls. And so what I'm really saying is that, yes, of course, artificial intelligences will change the human world of work. Some of that is already happening. It's very clear in certain actually white-collar processing roles that AIs are removing the need for certain categories of activity. But that doesn't mean that there won't be new jobs that get generated in this world, and nor does it necessarily mean that we will have a whole category of human beings who somehow, are unable to deploy their skills. What we need to do, and this is the point I made in the previous answer, is we need to understand what the social implication of what we're doing is likely to be and prepare for it. So it is about understanding which industries are going to be affected, how they're going to be affected, what particular roles are likely to be substituted out, and start to retrain, start to understand how the skills and capabilities of people in those roles can be migrated into new roles and new opportunities. So for me, it's about the thoughtful understanding of the way we are deploying these technologies, not a panic about whether or not these technologies are going to have an effect. Of course, they're going to have an effect, but it doesn't need to be a negative effect. It can be a positive one.
I'm very happy you mentioned also a bit about the effects of how we build up those technologies, because my next question, something I really wanted to ask you that has been in the press, and we've also seen examples of it, is AI and bias. What do you think are the implications of bias in AI? And how do we fight, or how do we approach those biases when we look at an inclusive AI and place for everyone to, have access to those technologies?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right that when you systematize human decision-making into a machine, you run the risk of systematizing human bias. Now, what's very interesting and doesn't get talked about very much is that the bias was always there, right? The human bias was always present in decisions that get made. The reason, for example, that AI delivered credit scoring ends up being prejudiced against women applying for credit is not because the AI is inherently biased. It's because the process of credit scoring previously administered by humans is inherently biased. The bias was always there. Actually, using an AI to deliver it exposes the bias that was always there. So the first point I would make is that actually making the outcomes clearer because you've systematized them can be a very valid way of showing the bias that was always inherently in a decision-making process but was previously hidden because you couldn't see all of the decisions happening, in a single cut, if you like. But my second point is that we clearly need to think about how the future that we are building and the inputs to the future that we are building, and where those inputs come from data that is in itself biased or reflects the fact perhaps that only a very narrow part of the population has been previously involved in making decisions, and therefore brings their own bias to those decisions. We need to proactively think about that and proactively think about managing that. And that's one of the reasons that last year in December, Rolls Royce published under Creative Commons license our AI ethics and trustworthiness framework, which is called the Alethea framework. We have been developing Alethea for the last 3 years. Initially, we developed it in order to help us think about how do you deploy artificial intelligences in processes which might be mission critical or even safety critical. How do you show that under those circumstances, an artificial intelligence application is actually trustworthy and can be used to augment a human's decision-making process? But actually, one of the things that became very clear from the work that we did peer reviewing Alethea is that because one of the questions we ask is how have you controlled for bias in the data that you feed into an AI model, and We also ask, how do you control for algorithmic drift? So bias that emerges across the development of a model. You can actually use the Alethea framework to help you think about whether or not the data that you're putting into an AI is sufficiently free of bias, and whether or not, if it's not, what controls you put in place to remove the effect of that bias from influencing your model as you then build it out. And so in the version of Alethea we're just about to release, a little bit of a preview here, we will be this year on the first anniversary releasing a variant of Alethea 2.0, which includes a data bias component element. So we've been working this year on actually codifying how you control for data bias before that data goes in to your AI model development process. So the next version of Alethea will include a data bias framework, a data bias management framework, as well as the basic AI ethics and trustworthiness framework we released last year.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for answering that question, and thank you for giving so many insights into what is next. Obviously, like you said, Rolls Royce is at the forefront of sharing those technologies. And I would like to sum up this part of the interview where you explain more about your work and about what Rolls Royce focuses on with a piece of advice for leaders that listen. And obviously the AI and IoT will continue to impact, and it already impacts the large industries. But what is a piece of advice when it comes to what the future brings? Is there something that you see as trends, or something that you see as pieces of advice for them to take into account?
I would genuinely say the single biggest characteristic that I look for in my team, especially in the leaders who are emerging in my team, is curiosity. That is the single most important characteristic. I have individuals in my team who have come to data science, as a mid-career change, who have, I have members of my team who have always been data scientists. I have PhD holders. I have specialists who come from an educational psychology background. I have specialists who come from I have actors, I have fashion designers. Literally, my community has the most fabulous diversity. It has diversity of ethnicity, it has diversity of gender, it has diversity of age, it has diversity of background. Those things are critically important to make sure that the applications that we build are as far removed from that biased position as can be possible. And the biggest and best characteristic that helps you to avoid bias is curiosity. Because if you are curious, really passionately curious about the world, curious enough to go and learn a completely new career, curious enough to constantly be updating your skills, curious enough to be, posting all manner of extraordinary news stories on our WhatsApp feed that the group shares, and exploring those with colleagues, then I think you are better placed to end up with work that doesn't actually encapsulate some of the human bias that we already have in the algorithms that we're building going forward. So my piece of advice would be, don't only look for curiosity in your team, because it's vitally important, but also foster curiosity in yourself. It always feels a little bit like we're balancing on one foot, on a small piece of something floating in the middle of a scary sea. But that's okay, because you can always jump to the next piece of floating, material. And that is really, you've got to thrive in that. You've got to thrive in that uncertainty and thrive in that, in the imaginative opportunity that's given by not knowing quite what is coming next. You've got to get comfortable with that feeling.
Fantastic advice, Caroline. Thank you so much. It's really impressive to obviously read about your career, see the impact that you create, and also understand the kind of leader that you are. And I would love to, for the background and for all the women and men listening that are interested in your career path, tell us, how did you end up working with data and AI from a background in arts? How did you make that transition? How did you take this decision?
Well, to be honest, Alexandra, I was there was an awful lot of luck, if I'm going to be really, hand on my heart, honest about how my career's evolved. So I graduated from university in 1995, which is important because that was the period, the mid-90s is the period of time when the World Wide Web was just beginning to show up in corporate life and in the consumer mindset. Okay, so the internet had existed for 25, 30 years prior to that, and mostly been used as a kind of a communications network in the defense marketplaces and then increasingly in academic sectors. But it wasn't until the mid-90s that it started showing up in terms of two different technologies. One was email, and the second was the World Wide Web as a kind of shop, as the world's shop front, if you like, the place where you could go to gather information or to find out information as a consumer. And so I left university just at this point when this technology was beginning to come into people's minds. And I joined a publishing company, and they produced at that point, paper catalogue, right, of all of the books that they published every year. And this paper catalogue, cost a lot of money to produce and had to be printed in China and shipped back and forth all around the world. And I remember going to the marketing director of this publishing company and saying, do you realize I could build you a website and you could put it on that? And he's like, what's a website? And I'm like, well, the technology you use to send messages around inside the company, the email technology. And he's like, well, my secretary sends those, but yes. And I said, well, the same technology that you use to communicate inside the company, we can use to communicate outside the company. And what we can do is we can put images of all of the products up like a catalog, but people can see it through their computers. And he said, okay, well, have a go. So I went off and I taught myself HTML 2.0, that's how old I am, and image mapping. And I built the first externally facing website for this division of the publishing company I worked in. And I was happily loading this website up and hosting it on the company's servers. And the IT department found me because they, ran a sweep of who was putting what on the corporate servers. And they came and said, you can't build a website from inside the marketing division. And I'm like, well, I have. And they said, well, okay, you don't have to take it down, but you have to come and work in IT because effectively you've pretty much hacked the company's servers, and we can't have that happening. So come and join us in IT. So at that point, I, as an arts graduate working in the marketing department of a publishing house, I just got picked up and dropped into the IT function, and I've never really looked back. I've always had a career in technology ever since, and I've always been very interested in the waves of technology that are driving change in human activities. So, I went from looking at the internet to looking at the mobile internet, and then I went from looking at the mobile internet to looking at the internet of things, and then I went from looking at the internet of things to looking at big data and artificial intelligence. And along the way, I spent a little bit of time looking at virtual reality and kind of augmented reality. And in the last few years, we've spent a little bit of time also looking at, kind of some cutting edge spaces around quantum, as well as the artificial intelligence work that we've been doing. And what I've always been really interested in is not perhaps so much the technologies that will land in 10 years time or 15 years time or 20 years time, but the technologies that will transform people's lives in the next 5 years or the next, so that's where my space of interest lies. It's in the things that, change how we work and how we live and what that means for us as people.
That's very, very interesting. And I love the fact that you also attribute luck to your career path, because there's a lot of people that would not necessarily say, oh, I was lucky, I was in this situation, and then someone told me, hey, this makes more sense in this department, and it gave you a new perspective. So when you look back, would you say that there is something you attribute your success to? What do you tell people that say, I will never be able to do that? This is not me. I cannot end up in this career path without planning it. What do you feel it's really true when it comes to choosing your career path?
So I'm going to tell you what I think about me, but I'm not necessarily sure I'm going to offer it as advice for anybody else. Okay, so I just want to caveat my answer by saying I will happily share my experience, but I'm not sure I would suggest it as a pathway for others to take, and I think others need to think about what path they want to choose. But you know that point in a job interview where they ask you that really awkward question where they say, "What do you want to do in 5 years' time?" And what they really want you to say in answer to that question is, "Oh, in 5 years' time, I would like to have progressed to, you know, the next role in the hierarchy. I still want to be in this organization. I still want to be making a big contribution to this organization. I see my career path following through." You know, so what they really expect you to say is, I want my manager's job, right? So I'm applying for this job. You're asking me who I want to be in 5 years' time. My answer is you, right? That's what they're expecting. My answer to the question, what do you want to be doing in 5 years' time, is I don't care as long as it's interesting. That generally raises a few eyebrows in conversations with, you know, managers and HR people, because it's not the answer that they're expecting. And it implies that if they don't provide me with interesting work, I will go and find interesting work somewhere else. And I've always given that answer because it's the truth, because it's the honest truth. Now, I am lucky enough at my stage of my career to be able to generate my own interesting work. You know, so if I decide that there's an area that I would like to go and focus on and I have curiosity about, usually I'm able now in my career to go and ask, you know, to say, I think we've got a real opportunity here. This technology is going to bring change. We should understand it. You know, I'm going to bring it into, you know, the remit of my team, and we're going to go and explore it. So I can kind of make my own interesting work now. But, you know, back when I was in my mid-20s or my early 30s, absolutely, my answer was still the same. You know, what is most important to me is that the work that I'm doing is interesting and meaningful. And so I'm going to go where the interesting and meaningful work is. And that doesn't mean that therefore I've built a particularly structured career, right? Because what's driven my career is, where is there interesting technological change that will have a meaningful impact on society? And wherever that is, that's where I go. So that's when I started the answer to say, I'm not sure I would necessarily give this advice to everybody else. If you have a more structured approach, if you're more comfortable or you need to set, you know, clearer tram rails for yourself in order to feel that you can perform at your best, my approach to life is going to make you feel super, super uncomfortable. But what I would say is, don't allow the structures that you set yourself to create too rigid boundaries on your curiosity. Curiosity for me is that critical factor. And so even if you feel more comfortable with a more formal path, and lots of people do, and that's absolutely fine, make sure you leave enough space around that formal path to go off and explore some kind of left field, slightly random ideas, because I think you'll find that gives you a lease of creativity, which you can then bring back into your more structured route through. And I think there's as much, you know, gone are the days, I strongly believe, and I'm glad that they're gone, when the expectation was that, you know, as a perhaps somebody in their mid-20s or late 20s joining an organization, you would completely change yourself to fit in with the culture of an organization. I think now there is a much clearer understanding that there needs to be a good cultural fit, right? You need to find an organization within which you can be yourself, your authentic self. The organization needs to bring people into it, which increase its diversity. So, you know, there is a real vested interest in organizations embracing diversity, and that means accommodating a much broader set of personalities. When we started talking about what R² Data Labs was and what it means to us as a leadership team, we came up with a set of words which for us describes what R² Data Labs is. We call ourselves punks, geeks, and superfreaks. And for us, that's a really deliberate choice of words. They are non-gendered words. They're not words that point to any particular characteristics beyond a kind of iconoclastic, you know, challenging the social norms, being fabulous, expressing yourself, being able to be your full, authentic person, whether you're a punk, a geek, or a super freak. And we deliberately chose over the last sort of 30 or 40 years, the biggest countercultural icons of the Western world. So, whether it's the punks from the 60s and 70s, whether it's the geeks from the 80s and 90s, or whether it's the glorious Superfreaks from the early, days of the 2000s, that for us is who we are. That's our community, and we love the fact that we celebrate that diversity, and our commitment to being punks, geeks, and super freaks is reflected in we hold a list of like more than 150 icons who represent those three communities, who our group, R Squared Data Labs, have elected to be, the kind of the faces of what that means to be in our community. So we take it very seriously.
And I also think that by sharing this answer, you've made some leaders that are listening also maybe question a bit the way that they present who they are and what sort of community they want to build. Because like you said, the moment you share this motto, so to say, people already know if they belong or not, in the sense that they're like, oh, well, I'll be joining a very diverse non-gender specific team that really looks for the future, and it's represented by people from all backgrounds. So this is what I'm actually going towards. And I think a lot of people can learn from your example how to also create this community of people that feel they are included. And talking about inclusion and you being a promoter of women in STEM, you are already a role model for many young women and for many women looking to join the space of IoT, AI, data science in general. What do you see as barriers for seeing more women in leadership? And for young women listening, what do you advise them if they want to start or transition to a career in AI?
Okay. So I think there are still barriers, and you and I and others work really hard to try to challenge those barriers and to bring them down whenever we can. But they are still there. Certainly the technology industry still woefully underemploys women. The technology industry is I think at about 21% female representation. The engineering industry, which is obviously the other space that I straddle, being in Rolls Royce, in technology inside Rolls Royce, is about 18% women. So it's pretty bad on both sides. R Squared Data Labs, great. We're very grateful to say is running at around 30% women. So we're still, not up as, I think there's still a lot more work to do there, but we are certainly doing better on gender diversity than either of the two kind of background industries that we belong to. In terms of advice, I once sat on a panel speaking to a group of investment bankers, most of which were young women investment bankers, about managing a portfolio career. And this was after I had 2 children and taken a very brief career break for about 6 months before setting up my own business, and then ultimately returning to corporate employment after about 5 or 6 years of running my own business. And I remember sitting in this room looking out at the sea of faces of women, all in their middle to late 20s, all of them in incredibly, impressive financial careers in investment banks across the city of London, all of them who had this incredibly high level of anxiety about their future and about the choices that they were going to have to make, and the choices they would have to make about having children and how they could accommodate that within their career structures, the choices they might have to make about caring roles for their parents as they grew older, the comparisons or the choices they would have to make that they felt would prejudice their futures versus their male colleagues, their sense of exclusion from the workplaces that they were operating in, their sense of being held to different standards or assumptions being made about their capabilities based not on their academic performance or their working performance, but on their gender. And I looked at the sea of faces, and the first thing I said is be kind to yourselves, because the prevalence of postnatal depression is significantly higher in women with a PhD or a master's degree than it is in women with the academic qualification ladder you've gone, the more, if you like, the sort of greater earning potential your academic qualifications demonstrate for you, the higher the likelihood that you will find the gap between your aspirations and your capabilities and the reality that you have to face, a burden that impacts on your mental health. So the first thing I said was just be kind to yourselves, because you are operating in a space in which your own expectations are going to create challenges for you just as much as the unfairness of some of the things that you have to face at work will create for you. And then the second thing I said was never believe anyone who says that you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Because if you come and look at my CV, I will show you where the stitches are. Whatever choices you make, it is always recoverable. It is always recoverable. There is always a way. There is always, maybe you need to change some of the aspirations that you had. Maybe you end up on a different path, but there is always a way. There is always a future. And you should never feel as though any choice that you're making is going to be the end, because it is never the end. It is just the opening of another beginning.
That's very thoughtful and obviously very inspiring. I'm very happy you talked a bit about your different career milestones, because looking back, I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on things that you would do differently, knowing what you know now? There's this expectation that once you've reached a certain level, you have this reflection point where you're like, oh, if I knew what I know now, maybe I'll invest more in this and that. Is there something that crosses your mind when you think about your career path?
No, there is absolutely nothing I would do differently. And I don't mean by that answer that I got everything right, because I categorically did not get everything right. I made loads and loads of mistakes, and I would not unmake any of those mistakes. Every single one of those mistakes has helped me to get myself into a position now where I know the things that I know. I am still going to make more mistakes. Do you know what? I'm not finished making mistakes yet. If I'm, the point at which I've finished making mistakes, I will probably retire. Because if I feel there are no more mistakes to be made, then there's no more exploration and no more curiosity to be had. So not only do I not regret any of the mistakes I made, I'm grateful for having had them and learned them. I fully anticipate making a whole bunch more.
Thank you so much for covering that. You've mentioned something that it was planned by us to also touch upon. Obviously, it's a very personal topic, but we did want to touch upon motherhood for a few minutes, and your advice to, on one hand, working mothers who are trying to evolve in their professional endeavors, but also if you have any advice for women who consider motherhood or are mothers, but they feel like they won't have the same opportunities, and they, like you said earlier, they have this fear of choosing in between family and work. What is your experience, and what do you advise based on how you've gone through your own experience?
So I think, again, I'll caveat this by saying my choices are my choices, and I'm not necessarily sure that they are the appropriate choices for everybody. So I will share them. I'm very, very happy to share them, but I'm not offering them as guidance or advice necessarily. I would say, when I think, I have two daughters, right? So my children are both girls. And for me, one of the things that's been enormously important, and I learned this from my mother. My mother worked almost all the way through my childhood. She took, I think, a career break for the first years of my life, but she went back to work. She's a teacher. She went back to work relatively early, and certainly my younger brothers, she was working when they were small children. And what I learned from that was, in fact, because my father is a clergyman, there was a significant period of time where my mother actually earned more than my father did, because clergy don't get paid very much. And what I learned from that experience was not only that it was perfectly all right for women to work, it was perfectly all right for women to be the main breadwinner. It was perfectly all right for fathers to be at home, because, vicars work from their home. So it was often my dad who was doing the childcare. And, my mum would come in from work at 5 o'clock or whatever. And so I grew up in a household where all of those burdens were shared, and where equality between the sexes was just a given. There was never any question about it. And so when I had my children, I fundamentally knew that I needed to show them a world in which women could make the choices that they wanted to make, could live to the fullest of their potential, however that was. And that did mean sometimes making some quite hard decisions about, arranging for them to go into after school care every day of the school calendar, even when the school's like, oh, your children are in after school care again. I'm like, well, yes, because I'm working, and I'm making a choice to work because I'm showing them that it's perfectly all right for women to choose to work. And so I think for me, the choices that you make as a working mother are not simply about, do I need the money? Obviously, that's a clear and important choice, especially for many women who are the sole breadwinner or the main breadwinner in families, or single mothers. Sometimes it's about, I need work because I need to have my own stimulation. I'm a human being. I need my mind to be stimulated. Babies are lovely, but they're really quite dull. But it's also about showing to the next generation that they have agency. They can make choices themselves. They don't need to feel trapped by the constraints that the world around them might be placing upon them. And I think what I've tried to do across my career and my mothering is strike that balance between saying to my children, you can have passions, you can have aspirations, you can work hard, you can drive for your ambitions, you can love your family, you can be there for when they need you. You can reach out to the village. You know how they say it takes a village to raise a child. You can reach out to the village and it's all fine. It's fine if your granny looks after you sometimes. It's fine if you go into after school care sometimes. It's fine if you go to a neighbour's house sometimes. It's fine if sometimes mummy gets stuck on the train because there's been a breakdown, on the rails back from London, and has to phone up and say, I'm terribly sorry, could they stay the night with you? All of that's fine, as long as they're safe, as long as they know they're cared for. It's about showing them that life happens, and part of the excitement of that life happening is learning to live in your own agency, live in your own choices, and be able to occupy your space in the world, be the person that you want to be. My one piece of practical advice is outsource everything that you don't need to do yourself. If you are a working mother, you do not need to iron anything. You do not need to clean anything. And frankly, you probably don't need to walk your dogs or wash your car or do or maybe even do the food shopping, right? If you are able to afford it, or even if you can't afford it, if you can do it through a network of friends, outsource as much as you possibly can, because that way you get to spend more time doing the things that you want to do and doing the things that are important for your family, for you to be able to do.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I'm so happy we managed to cover all of the questions that we wanted to go through today, and also obviously learn from your experience, but of course take it with a grain of salt when it comes to copying your entire experience, because like you said, it's not necessarily a recipe. It's more the way that you've created your path that led you here. And now we talk about AI and the career women. I want to end this interview by asking you the final 5 fire questions. So these are 5 questions that Caroline will answer very fast to the point with advice or recommendations for you to look up. So what is one book you think everyone should read?
Alice in Wonderland.
Fantastic. What is the best piece of advice that you have ever received?
Trust your gut.
Great. Who is your role model?
My mother.
Fantastic. If you were to have another career, what would you choose to do?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I would like to have been a surgeon. I'm not sure I've been any good at it, but I would have loved to have done it.
Thank you. And lastly, if you could change places with someone, who would it be and why?
That's a really good question. I think if I could change places with someone, it might be Grace Jones, because I think she must just have the most extraordinary experiences. I mean, she is this fabulous, talented, striking, completely unignorable icon. And she must walk into rooms and people must just be like, oh my God, that's Grace Jones. It must give her the opportunity to have the most amazing experiences, because she sort of brings that aura of curiosity and oddness and imagination and freakiness with her. I think that's who I'd like to be. I'd love to be able to have that.
Thank you so much. That's really fantastic. These were the questions. So thank you so much for taking us through those as well. I want to thank you for joining us today, Caroline. This has been honestly an honor and such a pleasure to have an hour with you and talk about everything that we wanted to cover here today. I'm sure it was very inspirational for all of our listeners and our viewers on YouTube. So thank you so much for taking the time.
It was lovely to spend time with you, Alexandra. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you to your audience for listening.
And thank you all for listening today. Have a great day, and remember to follow us for more inspiring interviews with female role models.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of FemLead Podcast. Share the news with your friends and follow us on social media at FemLead Podcast everywhere.